So it's really nice to be here tonight. It's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to present to this meetup. It was kind of where I got started. It was the first time I presented anything about WordPress anywhere. So way back in I think I presented one time in 2009 before WordCamp New York City, that really big year that was at Brute College. So it's been a bit. I don't live in the New York area anymore, but I'm really happy to be back. So we are going to quickly, let me just get my screen shared, and I'm probably going to be bouncing around a bit. So, all right, hopefully, I don't actually know what I'm sharing now. So 1 second, please. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, I see your presentation,
okay,
and we see you as well.
Okay, perfect. Okay. It has a red box on a different place, so that's why I was confused. All right, so we're going to talk about getting the most out of block patterns and reusable blocks. There are a number of features in the block editor that are super exciting for those of us that kind of were self-starters in the WordPress development arena, particularly with theming, that don't know a lot of JavaScript. While it is critical to know JavaScript really to create blocks from scratch, there are things like block patterns, reusable blocks, and even block styles and block variations that you can create these really amazing designs for your own site or for your client sites with some tools that are a little bit more familiar to those of us that have been around the WordPress world for quite some time, or are familiar with classic theming and other PHP-oriented things and HTML-oriented things, but maybe not so much the JavaScript and the React. So this is a little quote: block patterns will change everything, from Justin Tadlock. He's kind of he was early person that I followed when I was really early in learning about parent and child themes. So it's kind of cool to see him still in the arena and to be saying good things about something that I think is really a really cool feature. So we're going to start by looking at what reusable blocks are. And Timothy kind of ran us through it just quickly a little bit, but basically what a reusable block is a block or multiple blocks. And if it's multiple blocks, it's going to have some kind of a container block so that there's something around the grouping. That can be a group block, it can be a column block, and the cover block, anything that can have inner blocks would allow for this, so that it allows you to manage the block or groups of blocks from a central location. So any changes that you make to a global block will apply to every instance of that global block across your entire website. So if you wanted to create a block that you were going to use on a bunch of different places, every post, for example, like if you had an author bio block that you wanted to insert into a lot of different posts, you would be able to save it as a reusable block. And then if you had a change that you needed to make to anything in that reusable block, you could save it one time and it would propagate out to your whole site. So, and that's one of the cool things about the reusable blocks is it's not like you have to go in to every single instance that you ever use that. The call to action is something that seems pretty obvious to me. If you have a call to action that you want to be able to insert, and then let's say you have a different promotion you want to present and you want it to go out to all of your old content, you could just change that reusable block and it would all go out. And it's, in a way, it's a little bit like a widget. If you were using widgets in a location in a classic theme, you could do something similar. But it's really great to be able to use the block system to do this. And it's easy to add anywhere into your content as well. So let's take a look at reusable blocks. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and share a different screen. Okay, So here I have a WordPress site using the 2021 theme. I have a page that I already started, and I'll just with a few blocks already in place. So what I have here is I have a group block to give it something to hold on to, because we're going to take this and we're going to convert it into a reusable block. Right now, these are just blocks that exist on this one page. Inside the group, I have a media and text block. The media and text block actually is its own container block, because you can have multiple blocks inside of this. I used the group block in addition so that I could get some space around the color background. And then within that, you have your heading, a paragraph, and then the buttons block. So to convert this from regular blocks that would only work on this one page, I select the outer block, the outermost block that I want to save as the reusable block. And I, in the menu bar above the block, you can get this drop down and then click add to reusable blocks. And then once I've saved this, it changes the view a little bit. You can see here that it's going to ask me to save this. So I'm going to call it pets call to action, and then save it. Okay. So, and now I can see if I click off of it, it's going to just look like the blocks that were there before. But if I click into it, it's going to show me that this is actually a reusable block. And if I try to edit it, I can edit it from here. I can make changes to it, and those changes will save back to that reusable block. So once you have saved a reusable block, you can then use it multiple times. So what you get is, from the main inserter, you get a new tab. If you don't have any reusable blocks, this won't appear, but once you have reusable blocks saved, you can access them from here, and you can see here I have pets call to action, and then I can insert it again, and I can have it here twice. So if I were to create a new page, well, let me show you the front end here. So let's delete this one. We'll update this page. Okay, so you can see this block is here. And if I create a new page, and then I can go ahead and there are a couple things I can use the / command, and since it was the most recent block I used, it shows up at the top. But I can also I can start typing in the name of it and it'll show up, or I can use the primary inserter and then select it from here. And then I don't have the beta installed, so I can't drag yet. But once that's available to core, then you'll be able to drag it over. And now I can see that I have this. Okay. And if I publish this and go to that page, you can see now I have two pages that have that same block. And if I edit it, then it will apply to both pages. So one thing that you'll want to know is that you won't probably necessarily want to edit it here. The other way you can get to it is in the upper right corner of the screen. There's a 3 dots options, and you can go to manage all reusable blocks. And what you get when you're here is something that looks very similar to the post listing screen. And you can actually edit your reusable block from here. Now, this is not a page. This is just the reusable block. It's got a title, and it has the content of that reusable block. So if I change it here, and let's say instead of dogs, we're going to say, or pets, we're going to say dogs. We can update that. And now we can go over here, and when I refresh this, it'll change that to dogs, and then the other page also changed to dogs. So that's the gist of a reusable block. It is possible that once you've saved something as a reusable block, so if I go back in to edit one of those pages that I was working on, I can take this reusable block and then convert it back to a regular blocks. And let's say I wanted to make it a lowercase d. Now, this is back to being regular blocks. So that first page that I did, that I just edited, it'll change it. But the other page that's still using the reusable blocks will not change because it's still using the version that's saved to the reusable blocks. So again, one thing that I would potentially use this for if I were going to create this kind of a thing might be a social block. Since you could then add all of your links. For example, and then have them saved and then use across your site. And if you were to add a new social network to your list, you could do that and then it would send it out to your whole site. So that is the basics of reusable blocks. So let's move on to what block patterns are. So block patterns are in some ways very similar to a reusable block. So let me go and get out of this. And we'll go into a new page that I created before. It doesn't have anything in it. But what we're going to do is we're going to open up the inserter and look at some of the patterns. So the WordPress itself comes with a number of patterns. So the ones that are buttons, columns, gallery, headers, and text are all core. So these all come with WordPress. You'll see that what you're getting when you view these patterns is an approximation of what you're going to see on the front end of your site. In the case of 2021, it starts off with this green background, and you'll see that that green background is actually reflected in the listing of block patterns. If I were to activate a different theme that had a white background, then all of these would change to have a white background as well. And the 2021 theme registers its own patterns. So it's got a few interesting ones, but like, for example, there's this one. It's see what it's made up of. It's a cover block with a spacer and then a paragraph and then another spacer and then columns and a spacer. So it creates this look. The great thing about these is that they're really good for placeholders that have already been partially configured to look the way that you want. So if your goal is to keep a really consistent look and feel across your pages or your posts, these can be a great way to do that. They are not, once you've used a block pattern in your content, it's no longer associated with the block pattern that was used to create it. It is just blocks. And then you can go ahead and you can make any changes that you like to it, and they will be independent of that starter content, which was the block pattern. So one of the most interesting block patterns that comes with 2021 is this overlapping images. And what this is actually is a combination of regular blocks that are part of core and a block style that allows the images to overlap. So they've done something kind of creative to combine those two features together. And the block styles are shown in the inspector column sidebar when you're looking at when you have the block that has a style associated with it selected. So let's see. So let's look at what you do. Well, let's see. I skipped over a slide. Sorry about that. So basically, the block patterns feature is there to provide a catalog of pre-made patterns, so which are made up of blocks and will allow users to easily create and modify layouts for their content. So that's basically what I've shown you so far. So we've looked at how to insert a block pattern. So now let's look at how to set up a block pattern in order to register it to a theme or a plugin. So this does involve a little bit of code, but I will, once we've gone through the code portion of it, I'll share some ways that you can do the same thing without code. All right, so let's say I was going to start from one of these block patterns that we already have. All right, and I wanted to, instead of these links, let's say I wanted to include the social buttons. So I'm going to remove this block, and instead I'm going to add a social. Ooh. Okay, so I can say social icons, and let's say I want to set them to dark gray, and then I can figure out how to work with this block. Okay, so I could say I wanted to do a WordPress one. Now, Timothy showed us that this block is getting some really great improvements. So once those come, it'll be a little easier to work with this. So we can add a Twitter one. Okay, and let's just add a Facebook. Okay, and let's say I already know that I want my email address to be populated. Okay, and then one thing is you want to try to be careful of these start to write or type sections, because this sometimes can translate to empty paragraph blocks on the front end. All right, so now I have done that, and I can change this to find me here. And let's say I wanted to change this to be, we'll make it a different background color. So now we have, let's say this is the pattern that I want to save. It's the only thing that's on this page. There aren't any extra blocks in place. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the outermost block that I want. And there are two ways to get the code. The hidden way is to do the more options on the block menu bar and then choose copy. And that will actually copy the markup for this group of blocks to your clipboard. The other way, if you want to be able to see what you're doing, is to go to the more options up in the upper right corner and go to the visual editor. And so I'm going to, or the code editor rather. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just so that I can show you some of what makes up the block pattern. So the blocks are distinguished from the HTML markup by these HTML comments. So there's going to be an opening comment that has some information in it that WordPress uses so that it knows what to do with it. And then it has a closing comment to say, okay, I'm done with that block. We'll move on to the next one. So you can see in here, we have a cover block, we have a paragraph block, we have our spacer, columns, our social link block with each of the links that we created, and then it all gets closed out. So what's really cool about this as far as the block editor goes is that if for some reason you were to change something and the block editor was no longer controlling your content, the markup, this HTML would all still be there. So your content wouldn't go anywhere. And that is something that was done to ensure backwards compatibility. So it allows content to kind of be portable, which I think is a really great thing. So we're going to take this code, and then I will show you how we are going to use this code to create a new block pattern. So I'm going to change my screen share again. Go back to the presentation for just a second. Okay, so once we've set up the block pattern, we're going to look at registering the block pattern. And basically, there is just some relatively simple code that is, I would make it similar. I would say it's similar to registering something like a taxonomy. and then registering a post type. The code is not quite the same, but it's kind of that same general idea. So the taxonomy would be similar to your block pattern category. So when I showed you the drop-down menu of the different categories, like 2021, and there was columns and quotes and some other things, text, those are block pattern categories. The great thing, the benefit of using a block pattern category, if you're going to register your own block patterns, is that it's going to keep them together. They won't get mixed in with other block patterns. So when you're looking for them, they'll be a little easier to find. So in this case, I have my register block pattern category. It has an ID that WordPress will use that's all lowercase with dashes. So my block patterns. And then what we have is a label that we're going to give it, which is what we'll see. So what we'll see in the dropdown is my cool block patterns. All right. And then if we go forward here, we can see what the register block pattern, actually I went too far. Okay, so then we have another call that's going to actually register the block pattern itself. So we have here, we have my awesome pattern. And then within and underneath that, we're going to add an array that has a number of attributes. It's got the title of the block pattern, a description of the block pattern, which doesn't really seem, as far as I've been able to determine, display anywhere, but it can be helpful as you're looking back on your code of what it was that you were doing. The category, the block pattern category that you're going to put it in, which is the one that I registered in the previous slide. Then we have the content. So the content is going to, I like to start mine with single quotation marks and end it with the same. And the reason that I do that is because what we're dropping in here is largely going to be HTML code. And if I'm not mixing my single quotes and my double quotes, then it's a little less escaping that I have to do so that PHP doesn't decide that I'm done earlier than I actually am. So in this case, what I have is something very similar. So there's a paragraph block, and then the paragraph text is "this is awesome," and then it closes the paragraph block. And then we close everything out that we opened, and that's it for the registration code. If you have anything in your code that's going to need to be escaped, like, for example, if you had a punctuation or something in this code that would cause this to break down, you may need to escape your strings. And there are lots of tools online that will help you do that if you're not sure how. The one that was shared with me at one point was this onlinestringtools.com/escape string. So, and I will send this a slideshow over to be shared out if anyone's interested. All right, so then we're going to put all of our code together. So what we're going to do is we're going to register a function called myRegisterBlockPatterns, just to give it a unique name. And then I'm going to check to make sure that this class exists. This class will only exist if Gutenberg is available. So if it's not, then this would just stop running and nothing would happen. So if it were inadvertently installed on a really old version of WordPress or something, it would not break the site. And then I just have the two register calls, the register block pattern category and the register block pattern. And then at this first line is adding the action to the init hook. So I just used the name of the function that I gave it. So let's take a look at what happens when I add it to my code. I'm just going to switch my screen again. Okay, and now what I have here is a very basic plugin that I created that already has some of this code in place. And what I've done is I've registered two block patterns here. One is called My Pet Details, and it has quite a few different blocks. So once I activate this plugin on my site, then this block pattern that I created previously will become available. And then I have down here just a basic one that just is ready to receive the content. So before I had copied the code into my clipboard. And so I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in here and save it. And now I can go back to the site. Back to the site. I'm going to switch back to the visual editor. And I am going to start a new page. Actually, first I need to activate my plugin. So it's called Simple Block Patterns. It's not in the repo or anything. It's just something that I made for this workshop. And if I add a new page, this would also work for posts. I can say my block patterns. And then if I open this up and go to my patterns, I can see now that my custom patterns are down here at the bottom. And you can see the two patterns. So this is the one that we just made together. And you can see that all of that content has been pulled in. And so that is it for registering block patterns with code. Now, I find this to be a little cumbersome myself. I would love to see us move into a place where it was possible to register these block patterns outside of the code. However, I will say that there are benefits to having it be specific to the code. And one of those benefits is actually that you would not be giving control over the makeup of the patterns to your clients. So they wouldn't be able to go in and edit a pattern that you had painstakingly created for them to keep their branding in place and accidentally ruin it. By having them added by the code, it keeps them safe. It also makes them quite portable. So if you have them in a plugin or a theme, you can move them from one site to another very easily. However, if you are in a place where you would like to register block patterns without doing the code, there are a number of plugins that are available that will allow you to register block patterns from within WordPress. And one of those, my favorite one, is called VK Block Patterns. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you how that works. And there are lots of them, and most of them work basically the same way. But I'll give you a quick preview of what this looks like. It looks a lot like what we did for reusable blocks. So I'm gonna go to my installed plugins and activate VK Block Patterns. And it adds in a new menu item in the admin sidebar that's called VK Block Patterns. And what it's done is it's registered a post type. The post type will allow you to either add a category, which is a taxonomy that's applied to this post type, or a block pattern. So if we go in here, you can see previously in the past, I had created the my category taxonomy. And then under block patterns, you can see that there are already some here that were there from another presentation. So if I go in to edit one of these block patterns, you can see that I had created this as a block pattern, and it's a lot like what we did for reusable blocks. And then if I go in and create a new post, and I go into the inserter and then patterns, and then I can choose my category, which is where these patterns were, then you can see all the patterns that were saved to the plugin. One thing to note here is that if you use a plugin like this to save your block patterns, and then the plugin is no longer available or disabled, then those block patterns won't be available to use again. The blocks themselves that exist on your site that were inserted using those block patterns will still be there as long as the blocks themselves are still in place on your site. So if you're using blocks that are not standard in core WordPress, then if the block plugin or theme with blocks registered goes away, then so would those blocks. So that is basically the entire thing in a very fast nutshell. So I would love to answer any questions that came up during the course of the presentation.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Daisy. All right, so feel free to post any questions into the chat, but we have one from Chris Collins. He's asking, when you create a new block, how does WordPress know which controls to provide for further editing?
So when you create a block, that is a somewhat more complex endeavor. So basically, you would build those controls into the block itself when you're creating it. So what I've demonstrated here is really more about how to work with the blocks that you already have.
Got it. And then, right, and the block pattern just inherits those tools.
Yep. Yeah. So if the control is part of the block, then it will be available to you in the block pattern once it's been inserted into the content.
Got it. Okay, great. Are there roles or capabilities on block patterns?
That's a good question. I think you could, if you coded in conditionals, it would only load those block patterns it would have to be built into the code itself, though.
When you register it.
When you register it, as part of, like, you know, how I had an if statement in my code. If you also were checking for permissions at that point, then you could potentially not load block patterns for certain roles.
Got it. Okay. Any other questions? Really? Oh, here we go. When you use a block pattern, it's then saved as a block. Can you name it?
What can you name the block pattern? So once it's a block pattern, it has a name because you registered the block pattern name when you registered it. Once you've added it into your content, it will not have a name any longer. I don't think that there's any way to label groups of blocks in the block editor once they're in the content.
Got it.
It's possible that there's a plugin out there that would do that. I have not looked.